Hi. Welcome and welcome back. And Matt, let me know when are we online? Okay. All right. I will say an official welcome to everyone, whether you are in the room or whether you are with us online. Just thanks for coming out, hosting this space and being together. Matters being with you. And so thank you for taking the time in your life to say, hey, we want to talk about these things together and wrestle with them as people of faith. And so just thank you. We're so grateful. Tonight, you of the ministerial team, you are stuck with me. Jeff is helping out with our our students who are doing First Communion. So invite you back for Sunday morning to get served communion from some of the students on Sunday morning in both of the services there. And so I'm really glad to be back from Scotland. Well, I'm glad to be with you. I don't know that I'm glad to not be in Scotland, but I am really glad to be with you all tonight. And tonight is a little bit of a different format than we've done. And one of the things, as you know, you come into this space with all of your own story, your professional lives and backgrounds. And both in the conversation during this segment and then in the one that we're hosting in December, we thought, hey, what a cool opportunity for us to be able to hear from one another, some real life stories and experiences and just insight from some of our community members about their work as it relates to the theme from Kate Bowler's work that we have been going through together. And so I'll say more about them and invite them to come and join us, but let's just pause first and I'll say a prayer as we gather. God, we give you thanks that you are a God who has been human and amongst us. So you know what it is to grieve and to cry, to long, to suffer, to know joy, to know pain. So God, in whatever we bring in our own hearts and our bodies, our stories, and our lives this night, might we again and anew know that you are a God who's with us and for us. And might we then also, in that way, have wisdom, discernment, courage, and love to help us to be with one another and all of our neighbors. For it's in your name that we gather and live. Amen. Well, I will let our panelists tonight say a little bit more about themselves once I invite them up. But we're so excited tonight to welcome up Kelsey Stars and Kathy Colway and Mark Patrick. And also we have with us Rick tonight. So come on up, y'all, and I'll start us off. What we'll do is for the format tonight then is I'm going to have them say a little bit about who they are. And then we have some questions that they have been given beforehand in terms of, you'll probably get a sense when you hear some of their professional work that they've been a part of. You might have some inkling as to why we invited them to come and have conversation. So there'll be some things I'll be asking them to just share from their perspective, but then also want to have some intentional space where if there's dialogue then coming out of your own readings, your own life, your own story that you want us to have in conversation with any particular member of the panel and the rest of us present to be a part of that dialogue, we'll have some space for that as well, okay? So I'm just gonna, there's the mic that's, Rick, yeah, respect. So why don't, actually, Rick, would you grab the mic by you and share a little bit about, your professional kind of background and experiences that you believe may have led to yourself being asked to be on this panel tonight?
I can do that. Can everybody hear me okay? Well, I think part of it is Jeff and I are both pretty good friends, have been for about 30 years, and our family's been members here as well. My professional life, I was a paramedic for 33 years in the fire service and emergency medical services. And then in 2005, had a career-ending injury that sort of forced me into a new affiliated career, but no longer able to do emergency services. So I was involved in emergency management or disaster services. And a lot of people think, well, what is that? Well, basically, it's this. I try to convince you to spend time and money that you don't have on stuff that you hope never happens. So as I told my panelists, and Jeff and I joke about frequently, I spend a lot of time in dark places. I've spent a lot of time in dark places, been involved in, I don't know, hundreds if not thousands of deaths, and a few successes, but overwhelmingly years and years of being present and being involved in some pretty serious traumatic and dramatic events in people's lives. And then I've spent most of my career since responding being in the anticipation business, worrying about the things that might happen when Israel and Hamas expand their conflict, and then what might happen here. What might happen here in our region when something like the Lisbon, Maine event occurs. Just this morning was part of a discussion of a police officer involved shooting and the trauma that that person went through as a result of their officer involved shooting and had to take a life, justifiably so, but nonetheless taking another human life. So I do spend a lot of time in dark places. I value my relationship with my best friend Jeff and my friend Mark, who happens to be a chaplain, but he and I have known each other through that business as well. So
Thank you.
that's enough about
Thanks
me.
for sharing. Thanks
Yeah,
for being
thanks.
here. We pass it to Kathy. Thank you.
Are you okay sharing with me?
Oh, yeah. Is that, yeah.
You're okay with me.
Yeah, other.
So I'm Kathy Colway. I am a UCC pastor and a chaplain. I've served both churches and hospitals, and right now I'm actually the director of chaplaincy at an assisted living facility. And I will say, I said I served hospitals, so I've did my residency and then stayed on as a staff chaplain at Methodist Hospital, and I also was a chaplain for a while at Ridgeview in Waconia. And they give you areas of specialty. When you're in the chaplaincy, you get a certain department, and so my 3 areas of specialty, I was in the birth center, which, they never call the chaplain when everything ends up okay in the birth center. And the ER and mental health were my 3 specialties.
Thank you.
Yep.
Yeah, thanks for being here, Kathy. Yeah.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kelsey Kreider Stars. I'm a clinical social worker, or in other words, psychotherapist. So I do mental health work. I have done that work for the last 15 years or so. My specialties in my work are with the perinatal population, actually, as well as folks who have experienced complex trauma, which usually involves a childhood history of abuse, neglect, or what we would call developmental and attachment trauma. I affectionately refer to therapists as the sewer workers of the soul. It's usually by the time someone's gotten to me, they've gone past friends, doctors, frontline workers, sometimes even pastors. We are not someone's first choice. So by the time they get to us, they've gone through most of the solutions that are readily available, and what's left is getting down there into the sewer. So I put on my waders and get on in there.
Thanks for being here. Mark?
Yeah, my name is Mark Patrick, and I'm on staff here, as most of you know. You know, I think our life prepares us to do what we end up doing. So I grew up with a single mom and my sister. We lived with my grandparents. My father was in the Second World War and then basically left us right after the war when he got back from Europe. So we had those things going on. My grandfather had, I guess, was some kind of Alzheimer's, although no one talked about it, and we didn't have labels for it back then, but that's what it was. And so we had all these things going on. My uncle, who would stop by from time to time to sober up, would, I suppose he was chemically dependent, as my father was. And so all of these things are my training ground in how to, well, work on understanding myself first. I'm not quite finished with that part, but also understand people that are going through different kinds of challenges and traumas and so on. And not able to talk about it very much. Certainly back when I was a child, I thought I was the only kid in my grade school whose parents were divorced. Of course I wasn't, but no one ever talked about it. So that's, therapists have a lot of that. You say, well, who have you talked to about this before? Oh, no one. So often they'll say. So they talk to us, or they'll talk to a pastor. I've worked as a pastor, I've worked as a therapist, licensed marriage and family therapist, and I've worked for 20 plus years as a chaplain in Burnsville with the police and fire departments.
Thank you. Thanks for being here. We had a final panelist who ended up having laryngitis and was unable to be with us. And I have a handout from her that's Janet Havens. Some of you may know that Janet Havens' professional work was as a psychiatric nurse. And so these are just, and I know there's other experiences from your lives and others in our community who have sat at this intersection of sitting in really just these acute moments of human experience where there is pain, there is trauma, there is grief, there is loss, and you've done that as people of faith. And so part of why we wanted to bring you in to have this conversation is you know what it is to sit with people where they've heard those well, we know everything happens for a reason, right? And these sorts of moments, and to be able to authentically speak from your own experiences, and for us then to be able to have some dialogue and conversation with Kate's book and work. So there's some different kind of prompts that Jeff had originally shared with you that I'm not going to just do hey, pop down and you have to answer each one, but just I would say if any of these particularly had stuck out for you or you knew that there were ones as they come along, we'll kind of just see how that flows. And then we'll also, I think, after I ask an initial question and there's some conversation, I think I'll turn it back to the rest of us to say, okay, did anything from that stick out to you? Any thoughts, noticings, questions, reflections? So it's not just, I'm not presuming either you're the only ones with any experiences, so knowing we can all also dialogue with that. So, but I'll start by turning it to you with the first question, if any of you this resonates for, you wanted to share about. So as we heard from you, your stories and a little bit of what you shared of your professional situations, what are some of those spaces where you've been faced with the challenge of how to offer support or encouragement to an individual or a family, in view of especially thinking of this book where easy answers, they fail. What's that been like for you? What are some of your thoughts or perspectives on what it's like for you sitting in those spaces? And then particularly, I think, as a person of faith, wrestling with what that's looked like for you in the midst of that work. So that was kind of the first question, if there's anyone who wants to jump in. And they did get the questions beforehand, so I'm not just totally putting them on the spot. Go ahead, Kelsey.
Yeah, I just want to name from the get-go that I think, and I'm curious what my fellow panelists think about this, I think it's way easier to be a professional in that space than it is to be in a personal relationship. So in some ways, I feel a little bit like a fraud up here telling you, my professional opinion. Because as humans, we are wired to want to do. We're wired to want to alleviate suffering. And as a professional, you're tasked with that. People come to me and task me with helping alleviate their suffering. and it's somewhat of a different contract often when we're sitting with a friend, with a peer in their suffering. So I just want to acknowledge the difficulty that's in, and I think for me the hardest times are when I'm not in a professional setting, and knowing how do I honor that impulse to do and to help alleviate suffering while also not imposing solutions or ideas before somebody is ready or even wants those. So.
Thanks for naming that. Yeah, Mark had a thought. And then we'll go to Kathy. Yeah, great.
Alleviating suffering is an interesting concept. I don't think we can. Both in ministry and in the chaplain work, we have an expression about ministry of presence. Simply being there with people, not trying to take away their suffering, or how would you do that? Convince them that it's not that important? Well, of course not. Or saying words that are going to somehow take away the deep, deep grief that they feel. Well, there are no words, and that's the point. There often are no words. One of the first, even though I was a pastor, it was kind of like a chaplain experience. I got a call at 5 o'clock in the afternoon from the police over in Hopkins. I lived in Minnetonka at the time. And he said, is this Mark Patrick, you minister? Yes. Do you know so-and-so? And he listed the names of the couple. And he said, well, they're at this house in Hopkins. They'd like you to come. Their 3-month-old just died. And I almost said out loud, come to do what? Well, what do I say? And anyway, I was in shock myself, and I made my way over to the house and walked in and talked to one of the officers. He told me what happened. And then he said, well, the couple is in the other room there. So I walked in, and what would I say? It was the first time I actually put into practice what I had been taught, but wasn't sure I believed, was that you don't say anything. So I just walked up to them and I went like this, and we embraced and cried for, I don't know, between 2 and 20 minutes. I don't know, time just goes. But 25 years later, the husband said, well, Mark, I remember that night when Charles died. And you just came up and you opened your arms. And that was just the right thing to do. Well, I'd heard it was. I thought it might be. And as it turns out, it was. I mean, there's a whole lot more to that story. But sometimes it's not with words. And as a therapist, we are expected to have words often. Yeah. But the client or the person, they have their own words, and they probably need to say their words more than they need to hear ours.
Well, thank you for that, and we'll get it down to Kathy, but before you jump in, just to say, again, Kelsey, thank you for naming just like how there is something particular about being in a professional role that's like different than as a normal like human just trying to have conversations when you're tasked with you're invited in a particular way that you're not in every space. And then, Mark, thank you for, I think, humanizing as well, that, like, this isn't about you all telling us the magic answers of, like, since she's told you all the things not to say and all the lies you believe that aren't helpful, here are all of the perfectly helpful, but what it means to have a ministry of presence. And so thanks for, Kathy, yeah.
Kelsey, I was going to definitely agree with you and say oftentimes, in a non-church setting, like when you're in the hospital or in the assisted living, I develop sort of friendships and relationships with the staff, and then they come in and ask, well, can you give me care in this situation? And so I often end up asking the question, do you want me to be a friend in this situation, or do you want me to be your pastor? Because I'm going to answer the question differently depending on what role you want me to play. And they usually are like, well, I want you to be both. And it's like, I can't be both. So I definitely agree with your first statement that, like, as professionals, sometimes we're given license with people that there are different expectations when you're somebody's friend and you're trying to give them, love them well and do good pastoral care for them just as a friend, it is harder. Yeah, it is harder.
Thank you. Thanks.
I think the question was, this is fabulous, by the way. I think the question was, are there situations that you recall that you've been in? And then it was where finding the right words or the right thing to say. Essentially, that describes my entire career. I would imagine, now, first of all, is there any doctors or nurses in here? Okay, so I'm going to give out a little inside baseball, so I don't mean to offend anyone or anything of that nature. But everybody in this room, when you call 911, you expect them to do something because you're having a problem. Sometimes it's a silly problem, but you don't know who else to call. So you call 911, and you always know the fire department will come, and usually the fire department will always fix it. When you have a life-threatening problem or something that you perceive as a threat to your own personal safety and well-being, you're going to call 911 and you're going to expect them to have the answers. And I'll give you some inside baseball. It's just dudes and dudettes like me. We don't have all the answers, but we're really good at making it up as we go. And we're really good at working together to achieve certain things, right? Now, that's a blessing and a curse because you're in that moment. I teach, occasionally I'll teach new paramedics, and you know it's time to get out of the business when your kids are old enough to go through the paramedic training, and the kids you coached in basketball are now in charge of other people's lives. So, but I would tell people, you're being brought in with all this equipment, all this fancy stuff, but think in your own experiences, what were the best healthcare or emergency interactions that you had, and what were the worst? My guess is the best were probably when the person acknowledged you and heard you and allowed you to name something and didn't approach you with judgment and say, well, I got all this fancy equipment, and we used to call ourselves paramagics, you know, because we could do anything, right? But the truth is, we're just a bunch of human beings, and I think we'll get into that a little bit later. But we're just human beings that are coming to this with all the human being stuff. Hundreds upon hundreds of situations where all that paramagic stuff, the fancy uniform, the pretty lights, the emergency system, was absolutely inadequate for the situation, and we knew it from the beginning. But we did those things really to care for the other people that were involved. I mean, I could give hundreds of examples, but I'll give you one. Hopefully I can get through it. My partner and I, who's a very seasoned paramedic, we go to this deal on a January night, like a Sunday night at 8 o'clock, right? Person not breathing. High acuity call, everybody goes. It's an elderly person, maybe in their upper 80s, living with their child, who is, you know, in middle 60s, retirement, and they can't wake the mother. And so we go in, the house is very, very warm. She's in a bed, looks actually very peaceful. Laying in bed, looks like she'd been sleeping, and I'm sure that's what happened, is that the person just thought, oh, mom's been sleeping, but, well, mom's been sleeping a little too long. couldn't wake her up. We go there, and there's 0 heartbeat. There's 0 electrical activity. So no medications are going to work. No, shocking, all that fancy paramagic stuff. None of that's going to work. Mom has died. But Mom's in a very nice warm bed with a bunch of blankets, so we don't honestly know how long ago she died, but there's 0 chance that we're going to be able to resuscitate her. And my partner, I would not recommend this, he says in that paramagic way, looks to the daughter and says, well, what do you want me to do here? And, well, what do you think she wanted us to do? She wanted us to do all that paramagic stuff and take care of Mom. And she looked at him and just completely broke down and said, that's my mom. And I felt about that big. So I was able to go with her and bring her to the kitchen and sit down and say, we could do all these things, but it's not going to change the outcome, and it would really be kind of invasive and very, detrimental, I guess, to your mom's peaceful passing. We will do that if you want us to. And she said, no, absolutely not. So then after that, I sat with her at the kitchen table and learned about Mom. While my partner did all the paramagic stuff, wrote out the medication list, did all the stuff, got the recording, and made the pronouncement of death. But of the hundreds upon hundreds of deaths, that one stands out to me in relation to that perfect moment to realize the humanity of someone else and to realize, frankly, how inadequate all of the training and all of the experience and fancy stuff helps
Thank you.
us overcome simple humanity.
And I thank you for that story and for naming that and the power of what it means to actually just show up and be human together. Because I know we've all had those experiences, whether it's with care providers, whether it's with clinicians, whether it's with pastors, whether it's with friends who we don't hear or see each other, or you're just dismissed, or, because that's some of it when we read this book, some of it I'm like, what we don't realize is that we can end up then diminishing the other person's experience. They just want to be heard and seen. This is my mom. That's all I want from you right now. So thank you for naming that, and thanks for what you share, Kathy. And so I want to pause and just turn it back to all of us gathered. Is there anything from what you've heard so far, and or just things that have percolated, any conversation back that you want to name? Or any particular question or thing that you would at this moment, I'll come back to other times too, but that you would want to hear some more directly in conversation. If so, just raise your hand and I'll bring you a mic. And if not, also know I have more questions and we'll pause again. So yeah, I'll bring you the mic.
Well, it's interesting what you said. My father died in my home. We were brand new to Colorado. We didn't know, and we'd only lived there about 3 months, and we didn't have any information about services that were available, and we knew he was dead, but we didn't know quite what to do, and so we called 911 because we needed a coroner, but we didn't know what to do. So. And they came in and did all the magic, which is not what we wanted them to do. He was dead. My mother woke me up in the middle of the night and said, your father's dead. I went in there, and he was dead. But it wasn't. He was only 50 57 years old. We didn't expect him to die. He wasn't, he'd had a heart attack about the year before, but death was not on our mind. But he was definitely dead, and that isn't what we wanted. So they finally called the coroner, and they pronounced him dead. And then when they took him out, my daughter was just 3, and the younger one was about 18 months younger, and they were just crying their little eyes out, and because it got very dramatic, and I think it could have been handled a different way, but we were stuck. We didn't know what to do.
I'm sorry that happened. I have another story that I will not tell, but it involves a Chinese family in a matriarchal society who was new to the country, and their mother was dying, and there were cultural and religious aspects to the death in the home, but they wanted to be within the law. Thankfully, it was at the end of my career with one of my more experienced partners, and they said, well, we don't want you to do anything. They just told us we had to call when she was going to die. I said, yeah, she's going to die. And said, okay. And we actually got to be a part of that experience of that family and that culture, how they experienced death. And it was completely opposite from what, it sounds like your situation was. So I appreciate you sharing that. Sorry that happened, but we have to remember our humanity first.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that story. It reminds me, there's a term, it's called iatrogenic, and it means help that's not helpful. And so much of the help we offer is beautifully intended. I truly believe that. That kind of gets to your last question. And it's help that's not helpful, right? And so as we're navigating, how do I be in relationship? How do I show up for someone who is in deep grief or deep suffering? I think that the importance of attuning to what that person is needing, and that it's going to change moment to moment, perhaps even. And that takes slowing down and getting really curious and being willing to get it wrong, or to offer a menu of options and be like, do any of these sound good? Okay, no, cool. That's totally, and it's okay that you don't know, right? But being kind of having that posture of like curiosity and responsiveness, so that whatever you offer, whether it's the hug or a meal or the magic, the paramagic, that it's doing so in response to attunement of what is going to speak to this person's need in that moment.
Yeah. Would there be any other one that we would take right now? Yeah.
When you're in your professional role, how much do potential legal issues get in the way of being human, and how do you balance that?
The dumbest thing that we could have done from a legal standpoint is to take a 911 call, respond with emergency red lights and siren, and then not do all the paramagic stuff. We never hooked her up to a heart monitor. We never gave her oxygen. We never gave her any medicine. But at the same time, we have to balance that with my partner. He's more experienced than I was at the time. And I was like 20 years into it. So we both said, there's just no way. We recognize death when it happens. Sometimes families will see that and then they'll panic, and then they'll expect you to do something because they don't understand the death process. But so from that standpoint, Ted, dumbest thing we could have ever done is to do all the things that we did. The best thing in the universe that we could have done for that family and that patient was to allow her to pass without being assaulted by strangers, without giving her a bunch of medications and procedures that would do nothing to change the fact that she was 90-some years old and going to die, surrounded by her family, offering her religious and cultural passage to her next life. We could have interrupted that. From a legal standpoint, we should have interrupted that, but we didn't. And he and I both talk about that to this day.
Yeah. Kathy?
You know, I would say, as the chaplain, as the pastor, I err on the other end of that. And often my organization has to consider legal aspects. And we have an ethics committee for when legal issues might take forefront, and I am usually the voice on the ethics committee that's pushing, how can we be human here? And how can we, not that we're gonna do anything to get us in real trouble, but I kind of find it my role in the system to be the one that brings humanity into it, and asking the tough questions of, you know, are these rules serving the dignity and the humanity of the individual that we're dealing with right now?
Thanks. Thanks for that. I'll pause. We'll come back for more questions. I'm gonna give them one and then I'll come back to you. If that's, unless, is it a follow-up right to this one? Okay, then we'll do you now.
It isn't rules, but it's laws that would prevent you from keep you from doing the paramedic things. In other words, as a paramedic, when my first husband collapsed, the paramedics came and he was dead. But since I couldn't produce certificate of whatever you sign?
Do not resuscitate.
Yeah. They had to do all the, they had the electric paddle on him. And, it was so painful to watch. It was awful.
Yeah.
But it was the law.
I'm sorry, that I think that captures the essence exactly of what I've been getting at is, in a way, you're right that sometimes the legal environment creates circumstances where they don't feel as though they can do probably what they felt was the right thing to do. But I think at the same time, what we had in our system was medical direction, and we called back and said, here's the deal. And this doctor, it just kind of all worked out. The doctor that gave us medical direction was a doctor that both my partner and I had worked with in the emergency room, as we used to be orderlies back in the day. And so as he was becoming an emergency room doctor, we were baby paramedics. And so we grew up together, so to speak, in the business, and he had a high degree of trust in our judgment. And so that was most of my situation, but unfortunately, that is sort of the environment that we don't allow those decisions to be made from a humane, dignified point of view, because it puts tremendous pressure on people that may not otherwise be prepared or able to make those decisions. Am I making sense?
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And again, I echo just that like deep grief that you were in that space where then, and that can happen where the law, which is designed to make things fair and to make things safer, can end up actually causing like tremendous pain and harm, which is part of what you were naming, Kathy, of your advocacy to say, hey, let's make sure as we're striving to be within legal bounds and to, not try to get into lawsuit trouble or cause harm, let's make sure that we don't end up causing harm by trying to not cause harm. Right. Yeah. 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 Yes, there can be a, yep. Providers end up in that kind of place too. Yeah. 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 Kathy, what were you going to name?
I mean, I am so sorry that you had to go through that. And I would, again, be the voice that would say, laws are, and here I'll give you an example. If somebody was found in a house and clearly they had been dead for 3 weeks, it wouldn't matter if there was a DNR. They wouldn't try and resuscitate. You know what I mean? So like every law, I think, has ethical boundaries and moral boundaries. And I think, being a little more sensitive to you in that moment and maybe turning to you and asking what your wishes are,
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean,
absolutely.
or,
Yeah.
there are a lot of, that scenario could have played out a lot of different ways that didn't hurt you.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry that it wasn't done more sensitively.
Thank you. Thank you for also so vulnerably sharing that and humanizing our stories in the midst of this. Carol Lee?
Well, I'll try to humanize this a little bit more. 10 years ago, I was in Arizona. My husband had just taken a 30-mile bike ride, and we were sitting at the dinner table, and he put his head down, and I said, honey, what's going on? And he didn't respond. And I didn't know what to do. He was 6'7". I couldn't put him on the floor. I didn't know what. I called 911. They were there almost immediately. There were 3 of them, and they were able to take care of him. And they said, we'll need to take him to the hospital. We were in Scottsdale, Arizona. We'll go to Mayo Clinic. We think it's been a stroke, and they're the best people to deal with a stroke. And he was 71 at the time. And I just thought, well, he'll be fine. So I went, I gathered his stuff. I said, they'll probably have to keep him overnight. And I called my friend Ted and Fran Yock, who were members of this church, and I knew that they were nearby. And I said, they've just taken Ron to the Mayo Clinic. And they said, we're just going to the movie. We're right by the clinic. He says, we'll go over. We'll meet you at Mayo. So I get his book. I get his glasses, thinking he'll be overnight. This is more than you ever want to know, I know. But and I went down there. Ted and Fran were waiting for me at the door. My friends at Glanville's, who belonged to CPC, they were there. And by the time I arrived, the doctor came out within minutes and said, I'm sorry, there was nothing we could do. Your husband has passed away. He's in the emergency room. Well, he was fine at 5, he was gone at 7. And just the shock of it. And then they wanted me to come in the emergency room and see him. And I went in the emergency room, and Ted went with me. They said the chaplain is coming down. The chaplain came down and prayed with us. And and I've told this to my friends here, you think of the weirdest thing. I thought they cut his pants up, and they took that beautiful Nordstrom shirt I bought for him at Christmas time. They cut that off of him. And it was just but what really made it work is that my friends took me back to their house. They weren't going to have me stay alone. My kids, three kids from Oregon and here, were there the next morning by 9 a.m. But it's a shock of it all, you know. And I haven't talked about it with my friends, but it was a shock to everybody here too. And so anyway, no one came to talk to me, but my minister from my church down there, he came down that night to Mayo Clinic and was with me and prayed with me, and Ted and Fran prayed with me, the Glanvilles prayed with me, and that made all the difference. So.
Yeah, you shared part of that story last week with me, and I've been thinking about it. And you know, I'm gonna offer a different observation, like something from my own life. When I was at Methodist Hospital, I had a couple of ER doctors who I developed a good relationship with, and knowing how shocking things like heart attacks and strokes and can be, they would call me in, and sometimes they would know that the person had already passed and there was nothing that they could do. But they would call me in and have me sit with the person and kind of say, we're doing everything we can and we don't know anything yet. Can I pray with you? And, you know, in that 10 or 15 minutes when you're in shock, you know, you're not going to actually remember, you know, the exact time or anything like that. And sort of sit with families and prepare them to hear the news. And then, you know, half an hour later, the doctor will come in and say, I'm sorry, there's nothing we could do. But I did like the buffer, yeah. And I'm sorry that, you know, the doctor came before the chaplain. You know, like in a perfect world, that would not have happened. And, you know, I think in hospital settings, it happens a lot. Like, they deliver the hard shock first and then ask, you know, when in actuality, many people have said what you just said, which is, I wish the chaplain had gotten there first. You know, and you know, some doctors, it's nuanced. You know, it like they understand, you know.
Thanks. Thank you.
Heart, yeah.
But had I not had friends there to be there with me, I don't know what I would have done. I mean, that was all the difference in the world. And the pastor from my church, which was my temporary church when I'm in Arizona for 2 or 3 months, that he was there, and then he did the service down there before I came back to Colonial for my meeting house, excuse me. But we've been members here 52 years, so it's hard to keep remembering meeting house. But anyway, they came back, and my friends were there with, Sally was there with her blanket, you know, and everybody came, and it was an amazing thing. So anyway, we're lucky to have friends.
Thank you for sharing. Will you grab the mic, Rick?
I was just going to say, I just want to hug you so bad right now, but I'm going to not do that because I'm just getting over being sick. But what I like about that story, if I can, what made the difference, and it was the presence of your friends. And that part of it didn't change the outcome, didn't change the delivery, although it sounded a little bit clinical. And that's kind of on those of us that operate in that system. We got to be a little careful about how we deliver that kind of news. But what made the difference was the presence of your friends. You didn't once say, they said these 7 things and it made it all better. You just said they were there. I just want to give you a
Yeah.
hug so
Yeah.
bad.
Yeah, which
And they're
is
still there.
yeah.
Yeah.
You know, and thank you with that. And I think that's back to what you shared too of the ministry of presence, and that connects with one of the questions I think too. It was going to be, what are the 7 things we should all perfectly say to people? Right? No, that wasn't one of the questions we had for tonight, right? But what are some of the ways where you've seen folks? Like what are some things folks have said, either alternatively pick either one of these, that you would just say, hey, there's a lot of harm that we can inadvertently cause through either doing or saying this sort of thing, and or positively. We're hearing some echoes clearly, showing up, presence, humanizing. Are there other things that you would encourage from your work of what makes a difference in a situation of acute experience of trauma or just terrible, pain, suffering, et cetera? So kind of either side of that, if you all would take a run at that, and we'll go from there conversationally.
I'll have more ideas in a little bit, but first and foremost, I just want to say any sentence that starts with "at least," just stop talking. Just don't say anymore. Just stop right there. Because no matter what comes after "at least," it's likely to have the impact, no matter how beautifully intended, it's likely to have the impact of minimizing the experience of that person, which is often the opposite of what you need.
Thank you. Thanks for naming that. Yeah.
I just wanted to add that, when my dad died, we didn't know anybody. We didn't have any church connection. We had been there such a short period of time that all we had was each other, and they just took him away. And it was just such an empty feeling. My little kids were crying, and it was devastating because there was nobody there to help us.
That's where the ministry of chaplaincy, that's what it's designed to do, is to be with the family. We always stay until the person's body is taken away. Stay with the family. And sometimes the family members will want to say goodbye or have us offer a prayer with the person who's just died and offer words of whatever comfort they can be, but just be with them during that time. One of the things that we do, whatever our position or relationship with someone else is to allow them to express themselves with whatever words they like. I forget the author's name, but she wrote about abuse. She said, when I really feel heard, then I don't have to yell anymore. And that's what we do, we listen. One of the stories that's had most impact on me, a woman I met after her partner had died. I was called as a chaplain to the house, and her partner had died overnight. And this was a couple that came to the Twin Cities area to get a new start, and they weren't going to use drugs anymore. And they didn't until he did that night, and he died. So when I arrived at the house, again, I talked with the officers, of course, and they said, well, she's out on the porch. You can go and talk to her now. And again, it's the same question. Talk to her. What do I say? So I introduced myself. I said, I'm so sorry that this happened. And then I just shut up. And she was chain smoking. She was so nervous, so tight with emotion. And after a period of time, she said, Jesus Christ, why did this have to happen? So I did the best thing I could. I didn't say anything. About a minute later, she said the same thing, just as loud. Jesus Christ, why did this have to happen? Waited a little bit longer, and it just seemed right. I said, you know what that sounds like when you say that? No, what? Well, it sounds like a prayer. A what? I said, no, it sounds like a prayer. Would you like me to pray with you right now? Oh, yeah. Yeah. And all of a sudden she was open to, again, you develop a sense about when it's right to you to ask the question. So I prayed with her. I said, Jesus Christ, why did this have to happen? Then I repeated it, Jesus Christ, why did this have to happen? Went on to pray that, Lord, we know there's no good answer. There's no answer that will satisfy us, but we really need you now. So be present here. Her whole demeanor changed. She wasn't tight. She was able to breathe. We went on to talk for probably 20, 30 minutes. But that there's no how-to on that kind of thing. You live in the moment. The more present you are in the moment, the more you'll know what to say or what not to say.
I think one of the phrases that has kind of come to my wheelhouse is some version of, gosh, I can't imagine how you're feeling right now. Or, gosh, I can't imagine how you're dealing with all of this. Or, Carolee, I can't imagine how you're carrying this. And oftentimes, I think people are actually kind of trained in the business world, in leadership. I think often people get told, oh, the way you build empathy is like, oh, Sarah, you went to United, I went to United, we share something in common. And so often people step in with, oh my gosh, you had breast cancer? Do you know what? I had breast cancer 10 years ago. And I think there are places and times where that's a good way to build empathy, but when you're talking about loving and caring for people and you're talking about helping your friends, being a pastoral presence, with church members, it's maybe more important to just leave the space, keep that awkward silence going 5 seconds longer than maybe what you're comfortable with. And don't always make it a tennis match where it goes back and forth. Oh, you have this, I have this. You have this, I have this. And instead, just leave space for the ball to stay with the other person. I think I'm probably giving away all the Pastoral Care 101, training that we've gotten along the way, but there's some sort of gift in having the empathy rise in you without having to tell your story. I could respond with, gosh, I lost a spouse too. But that brings it back to me. And that's usually not what people need in that moment. What they need is, gosh, Carolee, I can't imagine how you live through that. I can't imagine how that feels. And so, finding that empathy, or, if you understand what it's like to be in a new place when someone you love, saying, gosh, that must have felt really lonely. Instead of, well, I experienced the same thing too, which works in the business world. I'm not going to discount that as a strategy for building empathy, but I think when we're talking about trauma, grief, loss, there can be a different way.
Thanks. Rick?
I just want to reinforce, and maybe this is a segue. We for sure didn't practice this, but sometimes the best thing to say is nothing at all, as I think Mark said earlier in our conversation. Most of the time, that's about us feeling uncomfortable. And so we have to say something, or we feel like we have to say something. And as clinical people, sometimes you get caught up in the jargon or the medical procedures or the medications or the things that you could do or try or whatever. But as that woman reminded my partner, that's my mom. She didn't care about procedures and asystole and the statistical significance of resuscitation after asystole and da-da-da. She just, that's my mom. And what are you saying? What my partner is trying to tell you is anything that we do isn't going to change, and I think your mom has passed. And it was at that point where she kind of realized everything that I had been fearing and everything that just caved in on me as a tidal wave is actually happening. And see, we go to school for all the other stuff, but you know how much training I got in 1984 as a paramedic student in telling someone their mother has died? 0. So I kind of went with some of those things that made me feel good, that were not helpful and sometimes harmful, like, well, they're in a better place. No, the best place is with me. It's kind of hard to tell that to a mom whose baby has just been murdered by the babysitter. There was no words. That's why I love my friend Mark, because we've talked a lot about this over the years, is sometimes you just sit there and you wait for that moment and there's no moment. That's okay. But you're also not leaving that mark or that painful event just because you're trying to fill some space.
Thanks. Thank you. I'm going to turn it back. Are there, as you've, I'll come to you, Paige.
Yep, great. You got it. Kind of part of what Mark said and part of what you said, Rick. In my work in pediatric intensive care and then pediatric hospice, and now as a legal nurse helping families who have experienced medical malpractice, I've seen a lot of those angry responses, and the losses I've helped families with have been more anticipated, where they feel it coming. It's very rarely been sudden losses. And I think I've seen people in so many different stages of grief that, that angry response is something that I've encountered a lot. And I think sometimes I think of it as almost like this concept of like intensity matching or like intensity mirroring, and just letting somebody have those experiences. And it's okay if I say something or don't say something. But I remember so many families who just needed to be angry, and it was never directed at me, but just to be there and to let them know it's okay to experience that anger. And I know, I remember one family in particular who we were having this discussion about withholding medical nutrition and hydration, and that was a really difficult conversation. And she kind of oscillated between being angry with the situation and angry with me. And at the end of the day, I think she was really grateful for just that arena to be able to go through those emotions. And I have a family now that is dealing with a child who died from an eating disorder that was mismanaged, and that really adds another layer and makes it very complicated grief because they know that it could have been prevented. And I remember he came to the attorney I work with and me and said, you know, you guys are the first people that have just let me be angry. And this was 2 years after the loss. And just feeling like letting that happen and not feeling like you have to take control of the situation.
Paige, I think you have brought up some really good language that I'm going to kind of pull out. You know, I am not sure if everybody knows stages of grief, but, you know, shock, denial, anger, depression, bargaining, and then finally acceptance. And you never...
They just added anxiety.
And they just added anxiety, because depression is not enough, right? And it's never linear, and like, yeah, you can get to the anger, you know, and as a pastor, you know, like, I think you have handled some very touchy situations as a nurse. As a pastor, I would add on to that, saying things like, you know, God is big enough to handle your anger. So let's get it out. You know, let's like scream at me all you want, because anger's part of it, and God is big enough. God is big enough to handle, get pissed off. You know, it's okay. And even to yell at God. Let's yell at God together. You know, like, it's a natural part of the process, and let's go through it together. But giving people permission to be angry is game changing.
I was just going to say, part of what you had named, right, is acceptance. And also that's a thing too, like acceptance doesn't mean like, oh, and everything's just all okay and that was just fine. But I think it's that space of like, it is true. This did happen. I think because that's part of the stages of grief, is that like, you know, but that's part of it, is when we think acceptance or following Jesus or whatever means, and everything's just perfect. Why are you upset about this? Right? Like, that doesn't help, because that's just not true of the human experience. And so thank you for naming that. Holly, you wanted to say something as our final, I think, because there's so much more, I know, continued conversation we could keep having. So Holly, I'll have you bring us into our last kind of round here.
It's not quite as nice of a segue as it was after what Paige just said, but what I wanted to say was kind of a shout out for Kate Bowler's podcast. So if anybody's really interested in this topic, she talks about wonderful things. And the most recent interview was just with David Brooks. And one of the things that I think I'm kind of hearing was really captured well in one of the comments. So the podcast is titled How to Really Know Someone, and he talks so much about when you can really try to understand the experiences that someone is experiencing. And so wherever they are in any of those stages, and allowing someone to have that time to shout, but you really get to know someone and the humanness of them when you can understand the experiences they're experiencing first and foremost, instead of any of the advice. And so just a lovely podcast if anyone listens.
Yep. And I think part of what you've heard too in some of the echoes, and I know some of you know this deeply from your own experiences, is it's both the humanizing and the attunement and the being present with the other, but you've also heard in this the being present about what's going on within ourselves. Because, right, like I noticed that when I'm feeling anxious or like I'm feeling overwhelmed by a situation and I'm not tending to that, I go into fix-it mode. Or I don't pause to say, hey, how can I be present? I don't see you in the midst of what you're experiencing, you know? Like, I think even, right, like I was ready to go to the next question and I saw a glimmer on your face that you were like, no, we can't go, right? Like, right? So like you were both communicating, but if I had just kept going, which I may have done that inadvertently to someone else, and I'm sorry if that happened, right? But those moments can happen where, because we're all humans, any of us showing up in the relationships too, and being able to notice. And I found some of that to be the most helpful stuff with folks is when I'm just able to notice what's going on, because then I can authentically respond like, I don't have words. Like, right? That's usually more helpful if you're going to say something, to just say, I'm just heartbroken and I don't have words, but I love you and I'm here. Right? That's usually, as opposed to like, I'm feeling anxious inside and I'm not going to say that. So I'm going to say like, everything's happening for a reason and Jesus loves you. Bye. Like, right? That never goes well. So, yeah. So thank you. And absolutely recommend the Kate Bowler podcast. That's a great resource, and just so many honest conversations are happening there. Is there any, just to like put you in any final parting word of blessing, benediction, encouragement, affirmation?
One thing about the anger, underneath anger is always some kind of hurt. And we call anger the secondary emotion. If you say, I'm angry, people say, oh, why? You know, what is it? And it's stimulated and fueled by some way that we're hurt. So keeping that in mind, the most angry person in the room is the person who's hurting the most. Kind of reframes it for us and helps us be a little more patient with someone. And the anger, it doesn't last forever. It feels like it does, but it doesn't. The other thing, that I love the stages of grief. We all talk about them. The one I add toward the end, before acceptance, is the stage of dialogue, of having conversations with people we trust, being able to say whatever we're thinking or feeling. That helps us move toward acceptance, whatever that is. But we're still going back and forth between all of the stages. But the dialogue, being able to say what I'm really thinking, is so helpful.
So a lot of what we're talking about here in attachment language is about co-regulating and creating secure space in the relational energy between us. And attachment, it takes attuning and attending. So attunement, that I'm syncing up with you. I'm syncing my energetic body to your energetic body, and I'm feeling into what it feels like to be in you. And then attending is that action of care, which sometimes is the non-action, right? Sometimes the action of care that's needed is the just being present. And sometimes the action of care that's needed is a meal or a ride, but you can only know that if you first attuned, right? And my blessing over all of us is that we have this incredibly wise guide in the Holy Spirit. And I believe it's the Holy Spirit that's resonating in me and resonating in you, and then syncs up in the space between us and whispers and guides us. So we don't have to figure this out with our own brain power. We have a wise counselor who is always moving in and among us, guiding us.
Amen to all of that. And I feel like there was one question we didn't get to, which was something to the effect of, you know, when people say really awful things with really good intentions, ... Is grace enough? You know, and I would answer that with, yes, I do believe that grace is enough. And when we assume that people are well-intentioned, even when they say things badly, like, you know, lean into the idea that they're well-intentioned. And you can still be, and then my encouragement as an East Coaster to all of the Minnesotans in the room is, and it's okay to say, that fell flat like a lead balloon, and that didn't work for me, but I'm giving you grace anyway. And having the courage to say that is another whole level. And the wisdom to know the difference. And the wisdom to know the difference. Yeah, yeah.
continue to be inadequate for this moment. Something that struck me as I was reading through the book was her experience of going into one of the many doctor's offices, and I don't remember, she said it was a nurse or a physician assistant or whoever it was that said, well, I think you got to get used to the idea of dying. And that jumped off the page to me like craziness. I walked my sister through lung cancer. My sister had an unbelievably difficult childhood, unbelievably difficult adulthood. And she was always fearful of doctors because when she was a teenage girl, our dad got cancer and just went from just this vibrant 5'10" robust Irishman, you know, little spark plug, but solid guy, to the shell of himself, and died. And I didn't have girls, but I know that we all need our dads during teenage years, and I know that for girls it's even more particularly meaningful during that particular time of pre-high school and high school. She just never recovered from that. So she gets lung cancer. And we go to see the oncologist, and I go with her. And the nurse practitioner sits down and she says, yeah, this is not a good situation. You've got lung cancer. You know, how about let's focus on being prepared to die, but ready to live? She said, let's take care of these things of being prepared to die, but we're ready to live. And I literally saw a weight lifted from my sister that day, because that resonated with her and certainly with me, that all of the things in this life that we build and we tear and we tender and we, you know, protect can be taken away from us so quickly. And yet, are we ready to live if we're the one that is left behind? And if we're not, well, then we're with Jesus. So that's a pretty good deal. And I just saw her live more in life in that 4 years since that diagnosis of lung cancer than I did probably the last 10 of her life. That nurse practitioner in the oncologist's office knew her craft, and she knew what that girl right there needed. But at the end of the day, we're all just human beings doing this thing called life, and we all need each other in some way, form, or fashion to get through it. And in terms of the trauma and things like that, sometimes we inflict it. Sometimes we're somehow caring enough to try and fix it. Other times we just witness it. But I think all of us need to remember that we're all just human beings, and that these are perfectly normal reactions to very abnormal events. The things in our catalog and in your life as well are not really meant for human beings to experience with each other, but yet here we are. So I think the grace message in that is that these are all perfectly normal reactions to abnormal events. And maybe that just comes with a certain amount of grace to say we're all just doing the best we can. And maybe the more we know, the better off we can act.
Thanks. Well, thank you so much to all of you for sharing, not just from your professional experiences, but from your own hearts and your own sense of lived experience and humanity. Thank you all for being present, and thank you also to those of you who vocalized and shared some pieces of your story for your vulnerability, and just to all of you for being present here. I wanted to leave you with a couple encouragements. The one is that this coming Monday night is it's All Saints. Actually, today's the first, right? Today is All Saints today, and on Sunday we will be marking that at church, and with naming the people in our community of whom we are aware have died this last year and ringing the bell. And then on Monday night, we'll be gathering a service of remembrance. It's a time, whether you have grief from a person who has died in your life long, long ago or recently, or whether it's also for global places in our world where there is grief that you are carrying. It's a beautiful service. We'd love to have you join us this Monday night. That will be in the meeting house at 7. Thank you. I knew if I just kind of kept going, one of you would jump in and make sure I said it correctly. 7 p.m. And then next Wednesday night is also our service honoring veterans. On Wednesday night will be our Wednesday night programming for adult ed. We will then pick up with our we'll have our mission event for all of us on the 15th. We would love for you to be here. That's the 15th of November, Wednesday night. And before I make you glaze over by telling you all of the wonderful things, make sure you're subscribed to the e-news so you can hear about that. But wanted to name that, and just again, thank you for that. So may I send you with this, just I'm going to piece together a few things as a blessing and benediction. May we go forth from this place, remembering that we have a God who journeys with us. May you know that you aren't alone, that you are cared for by the God who is the God of all comfort. May you also know and trust that in the midst of our humanity, there is grace for all of us. For we have a God who has practiced presence with us, and a Spirit who reminds us in this. We don't have to have the answers. We don't have to have it all. But let us lean in and let the Spirit be at work and breathe so we can attune and we can show up in ways that care and love one another. And if there's any place where you're needing to be reminded of that tonight, just be remembered that God is for you, God loves you, and you're not alone. So go in God's love and peace this night, and with gratitude and thanks. Amen.